My name is Nora Mercer. I'm 29 years old, I teach 4th grade, and last Christmas, my father looked me straight in the face and called me a fool for keeping a gift from my grandmother. It was a check, not a birthday card with $20 tucked inside. Not one of those polite little envelopes older relatives hand you so they can feel useful. This was a check for $5 million. My father tore his into strips over the dinner plate. My mother ripped hers clean down the middle and dropped both halves beside her wine glass. My older brother crushed his in one fist and shoved it under the table like it was trash. My sister laughed, carried hers to the fireplace, and filmed it burning for her followers. I was the only one who folded mine, slipped it into my purse, and said, "Thank you, Grandma." The next morning, the bank manager locked the office door behind me, asked me to sit down, and told me the 4 words that split my life into a before and an after. It's completely legitimate. But that wasn't the part that ruined my family. The part that ruined them was what came next. Before I tell you how a Christmas dinner turned into a courtroom war, a broken marriage, a public scandal, and the most painful kind of justice, take a second to like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read everything. Now let me take you back to the last Christmas Eve my grandmother ever hosted, because if you had seen that table, if you had heard the way they laughed, you would never have guessed how expensive that laughter was about to become. My grandmother's name was Vivian Mercer, and for most of my life, she lived alone in the same white farmhouse at the top of Linden Hill. The porch leaned a little more every winter. The gate squealed no matter how often anyone oiled it. And the front door, in 48 years, had almost never been locked. People in town called that trust. My father called it foolishness. I called it Grandma being Grandma. Her house always smelled the same no matter the season. In summer it smelled like cut basil and old books. In fall it smelled like apples and rain-damp wood. In winter it smelled like cinnamon tea, baking bread, fireplace smoke, and something softer underneath it all, like wool blankets that had remembered 100 cold nights. The Saturday visits had started so quietly, I couldn't even tell you when they became tradition. At first I came because I was in college and broke and lonely. Then I came because she always had soup on the stove and never made me explain myself. Then I came because adulthood turned out to be a place where very few people listened with their full attention, and my grandmother did. By the time I was 29, I had been going to her house nearly every Saturday for years, not for money, not for obligation, not because anyone expected me to. I went because, when I sat at her kitchen table, the world stopped feeling like it was trying to push me off a ledge. 3 days before Christmas Eve, I drove up the hill in my old Honda with a paper sack of pears from the tiny tree behind my rental duplex. Snow clung in thin silver lines along the road, and the sky had that hard white winter look that makes everything feel temporary. She opened the door before I knocked. She was wearing a mustard-colored cardigan, her house slippers, and the apron with tiny stitched blue flowers she'd had since before I was born. She put one hand against my cheek the way she always did, like she was making sure I was still real. "There you are," she said. "Come in before your ears freeze off." On the counter there was a loaf of walnut bread cooling under a dish towel. On the stove there was stew. On the windowsill there was the little ceramic cardinal she moved from room to room depending on where the light landed best. "Tell me about your class," she said as soon as we sat down. She asked me that every week, and she always meant it. So I told her about Owen, one of my students, the one who barely spoke during group work, but wrote the most heartbreaking stories in crooked pencil. I told her about how the school kept running out of markers, and how one of my kids had cried because another child took the only working blue crayon. I told her about the cafeteria milk cartons, and how you could tell which kids were pretending not to be hungry. She listened without interrupting. Her eyes never wandered. She never reached for her phone because she didn't believe silence had to be filled. "What do you think he needs?" she asked when I finished talking about Owen. "Patience," I said. She nodded once. "Then give him patience. Children bloom in strange weather." That was the kind of thing she said. Not dramatic enough to quote at the time, but impossible to forget later. We ate slowly. We drank tea from mismatched cups. I told her about the second-hand bookshelf I'd nearly dropped carrying into my apartment, and how one side still smelled faintly like cigarettes and cedar. She laughed so hard her shoulders shook, but when she reached for her cup, I saw her hand tremble. It was small, barely there. I pretended not to notice. That was one of the lies love tells you when it is scared. If I don't name this, maybe it won't become true. We spent an hour wrapping simple gifts. She made me knot ribbon because she said my bows looked like arguments. Then she disappeared into the pantry and came back with a small sealed envelope. "Gas money," she said. She had been giving me gas money once a month for years. Inside was always the same thing, 2 crisp bills, folded carefully, never flashy. I never spent them. I kept them in a box because what she was giving me never felt like money. It felt like evidence. Proof that somewhere in the world there existed a person who noticed the cost of my life and wanted, in some tiny way, to make it lighter. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the porch even though her hip was bothering her again. "Come early Christmas Eve," she said. "I will." She held my wrist for a second before letting go. "No matter what happens at that table, remember who you are." I laughed a little. "That sounds ominous." Her mouth lifted, but not quite into a smile. "That's because it is." I drove home thinking she was being theatrical. By New Year's, I would understand she had been giving me a warning. My mother never called to ask how I was doing. She called to announce some emergency, some grievance, some injustice she had suffered at the hands of ordinary life, and then quietly circled toward whatever she needed from me. She caught me halfway down the hill that same afternoon. "Nora, sweetheart, you're with Vivian again?" She never called her mom. Never called her Vivian to her face either. To my mother, my father's mother had always been an obstacle with a pension. "I go on Saturdays," I said. "You know that." "She's fine, honey. You don't have to make a project out of her." My brother Chase was apparently with her because I could hear him chewing. "Hey, I need a ride Monday," he said without hello. "Truck's acting up again." "I'm at school Monday." "So after." "I can't just leave my classroom whenever you forget adulthood." He laughed through a mouthful of food. "Still touchy, huh?" A text from my sister arrived before I got off the phone. "Can you loan me $300 till Friday? Quick turnaround promise. 3 heart emojis, 1 prayer hands emoji, no shame at all." My mother kept talking. "Christmas dinner's at your grandmother's, right? Make sure she doesn't overdo it. She gets dramatic when she's tired." Not one of them asked whether she was actually feeling worse. Not one of them asked why she'd been sitting down more often, or why she winced when she stood, or why the color in her face had thinned out over the past month. They talked about her the way people talk about furniture that might need to be moved. That was the drive home, when something cold and quiet settled inside me. Not anger, not yet. Just a realization I couldn't quite shape. They were all expecting something from her, and somehow I was the only one expecting time. The first thing my grandmother ever asked me to keep secret wasn't money. It was her death. She told me in late October, in the garden behind her house, while we were clipping rosemary and tying twine around the final tomato vines before the frost could take them. The light was low and gold, the kind of autumn light that makes everything look softer than it really is. She sat down on the old wooden bench beside the fence much earlier than usual. "You remember Dr. Shaw?" she asked. "Of course." She confirmed it. Something in the way she said it made my body go still. "Confirmed what?" She looked out across the garden instead of at me. "Pancreatic cancer," she said. "Stage 4. The whole world did not stop. That's the lie people tell in movies. What happened instead was worse. The world kept moving exactly as before. Wind shifted the dead marigold heads. A dog barked somewhere down the road, a crow landed on the fence and flew off again. Ordinary life continued as if my chest hadn't just filled with broken glass. "How long have you known?" "Since July." I sat beside her so hard the bench creaked. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I'm telling you now." "Chemo? Surgery? Something?" She shook her head gently. "No hospitals, no machines, no corridors that smell like disinfectant and panic. I would rather die in my own bed with my own curtains and my own kettle whistling in the kitchen." I felt myself starting to cry then, and I hated it because she wasn't crying. She was calm. Calm in that devastating way some old people are when they have already made peace and you are still trying to bargain on their behalf. "Grandma." "Nora." She took my hand. "Listen carefully. I am not afraid. I am sorting." That was her word for it. Sorting. As if dying were a matter of putting the right things in the right drawers before you left the room. She clipped one last sprig of rosemary and pressed it into my palm. "I want one final Christmas in my house," she said. "A proper one, bad wine, overcooked vegetables, your father acting more important than he is, your mother pretending to compliment the curtains while pricing the silver in her head." Despite myself, I laughed through tears. "I do not want to spend that night as a patient," she said. "I want to spend it as myself." Then her eyes sharpened, and I saw the old intelligence there, bright as a blade. "And I have a few decisions to make first." I turned to look at her. "What decisions?" But she only smiled. "If I told you now," she said, "you might lose your ability to look innocent." I didn't sleep that night, And over the next 2 months, every word she had said to me began to take on the shape of a fuse burning toward something I still couldn't see. Christmas Eve arrived under a hard gray sky. Ice glazed the fence posts. The fields looked skinned and silver. I came early, like she asked, and found her already in the kitchen with the turkey resting and potatoes steaming and the radio playing old holiday songs through static. She was moving more slowly than ever, not weak exactly, deliberate. She had dressed carefully. Same mustard cardigan, pearl studs, hair pinned back, lipstick even. A woman preparing not just a meal, but a stage. "Did you do all this yourself?" I asked. "I delegated absolutely nothing," she said, and handed me a bowl. I worked beside her for an hour. We barely spoke. We didn't need to. At one point, she leaned against the counter for balance, caught me seeing it, and gave me a look that said, "Not now." The others arrived like weather systems. My father, Calvin Mercer, came first, stomping snow off his boots like he was entering a building he owned. He was the kind of man who believed volume could substitute for authority. 30 years at a manufacturing plant had given him a foreman's bark and the permanent posture of someone inspecting other people's mistakes. He kissed the air beside his mother's face and went straight to the refrigerator. My mother, Denise, swept in behind him in a camel coat and expensive perfume, already speaking in that falsely bright tone women use when they're rehearsing innocence. "Oh, Vivian, the tree is adorable," which was my mother's way of evaluating everything in the room without appearing to. My brother Chase arrived with his latest girlfriend, a woman young enough to still believe he was temporarily misunderstood instead of permanently selfish. He gave Grandma one distracted hug, then asked me if I was still doing the little school thing. My sister Sienna came last, holding her phone in front of her face as she climbed the steps. "Holiday vibes at Grandma's," she sang to the screen before even saying hello. She didn't hug Grandma. She kissed the air near her cheek and turned back to find better lighting. There are dinners where everyone pretends to be a family, and then there are dinners where everyone is waiting to see what they can take home. By 6 o'clock the table was full. Crystal glasses, old china with a gold edge, candles, roast turkey, stuffing, green beans with almonds, biscuits, gravy, cranberry sauce. The silver star my grandfather had soldered by hand before I was born shone above the mantel. My grandmother's oldest friend, Mabel Reed, who owned the used bookstore in town, stopped by to drop off a jar of clover honey. She stayed only a few minutes, but on her way out she touched my arm in the hallway. She adored Saturdays, Mabel said quietly. "I hope you know that." Before I could ask what she meant, Mabel was gone. Dinner stretched. My father talked about layoffs and unions and what men used to be. My mother brought up a spa partnership she still believed was about to turn around. Chase talked about a construction contract that had supposedly been delayed by idiots. Sienna complained about algorithms and engagement and how impossible it was to stay visible online without constant emotional labor. Nobody asked my grandmother more than polite, passing questions. Nobody really looked at her. I did. And because I did, I saw that strange composure in her face. Not sadness, not fear, expectation. Halfway through dessert, she cleared her throat. Nobody heard her the first time. She did it again, softly, and then said, "I have something for each of you." That got their attention. She bent, lifted a small walnut box from beside her chair, and placed it on the table. The room changed. It was almost physical, the shift. Greed has a temperature. It makes the air feel thinner. My father sat straighter. My mother smoothed her napkin. Chase grinned. Sienna lowered her phone at last. My grandmother opened the box and took out 5 cream-colored envelopes. Identical, unsealed, thick. She walked around the table slowly, placing one in front of each of us. Mine came last. Her hand rested on my shoulder for 1 second too long. Then she sat down again. Nobody spoke. My father opened his immediately. The expression on his face changed 3 times in less than 5 seconds. Curiosity, confusion, then contempt. "What is this?" he said. Chase opened his next, then Sienna, then my mother. It was like watching 4 mirrors crack in 4 different ways. Inside each envelope was a check, $5 million, written in my grandmother's hand, drawn from First County Bank, made payable to each of us. For 1 insane second, nobody moved. Then Chase barked out a laugh. "No way!" Sienna held hers up to the candlelight. "Is this a prank?" My mother stared at the number like it had insulted her, and my father said with that ugly flat certainty men use when they cannot bear being surprised, "It's fake." He dropped his check onto his plate. My mother tore hers clean in half. "Vivian, this is not funny." Chase crushed his into a ball and shoved it beneath the table. Sienna stood, walked to the fireplace, angled her phone toward the flames, and dropped her check onto the grate. The paper curled black at the corner. Then the whole thing caught. She actually laughed. "Iconic," she whispered to her camera. My grandmother did not blink, not once. She only looked at me. The room felt suddenly miles away. My check was still in its envelope. My fingers slid inside, lifted it out, and for the briefest second the whole world narrowed to the feel of thick bank paper between my hands. Maybe it was real. Maybe it wasn't. But one thing I knew with absolute certainty was this. My grandmother was not confused. She was not silly. She was not sentimental in the careless way people assume old women are. If she had put this in my hand, there was a reason. So I folded it once, slid it into my purse, and said the only words in the room that weren't ugly. "Thank you, Grandma." She nodded. That was all. Dinner collapsed after that. My father muttered about manipulation. My mother said the whole thing was humiliating. Chase wanted to know if there was another envelope with the real gift. Sienna kept giggling about old money performance art. I barely heard any of it, because my grandmother was still calm. And that calm terrified me more than if she'd cried. I drove home through thickening snow with my purse on the passenger seat like it contained an explosive. The wipers dragged across the windshield. My hands were cold inside my gloves. Every few miles I glanced down at the bag as if I expected it to start glowing. At a stoplight I took the check out and held it under the dome light. The paper was heavy, professional. The routing number looked real. The signature was hers. On the back, in blue ink, she had written one sentence in the same slanted handwriting she used on birthday cards, for the one who came when there was nothing to gain. I pulled over on the side of the road and cried so hard I fogged every window, not because of the money, because suddenly, horribly, I knew she had been keeping score all along, not of what we said, of who showed up. The next morning, I drove to First County Bank before I had fully convinced myself to get out of the car. The town was still quiet from the holiday. The sidewalks glittered with old ice. The wreath on the bank's front door had lost 2 berries and looked tired. Inside, the heat hit my face so fast my eyes watered. The branch manager, Simon Hale, had known me since I was 16 and came in to open a student account with $12 and a scholarship check. "Nora," he said with an easy smile, "Merry Christmas. I just need to verify something." I slid the check across his desk. His smile vanished. Not gradually. Instantly. He picked up the check with both hands, stared at it, then looked up at me as if I had walked in carrying a live snake. "Would you come with me, please?" He led me past the tellers, past the wreath-covered vault door, down a narrow hall into a private office with no windows. He closed the door. Then, after a hesitation that made my stomach drop, he turned the lock. "Is something wrong?" I asked. "Nora, sit down." My knees nearly failed under me. He lowered himself into the chair across from mine, set the check carefully on the desk, and took off his glasses. When he spoke, his voice had changed into something formal and careful. "Did your grandmother give you this personally?" "Yes." "And she was fully aware of what it was?" "Yes." He nodded once, like he was checking a final box. Then he looked me in the eye and said the sentence that cracked my life open. "It's completely legitimate." I stared at him. "I'm sorry, what?" "This instrument is valid. The funds are available. Your grandmother established a protected distribution structure in November. I personally oversaw the issuance of several checks linked to it." "Several." The word hit before the meaning did. "Several?" He paused. "I should not disclose anything beyond what concerns you, but yes, several." My mouth went dry. I looked back at the check as if it might now explain itself. "You're saying this is real?" "Yes." "You're saying my grandmother had $5 million available to hand me?" "Yes." He folded his hands. "And if I may say so, this appears to be only one portion of a much larger estate plan." That room got very, very quiet. The heater clicked once in the wall. Somewhere outside, a phone rang. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it in my ears. Simon leaned forward slightly. "There is an attorney named Arthur Bell who may be contacting you. I suggest you answer when he does." I don't clearly remember the next 10 minutes. I signed papers. I showed identification. I answered questions automatically. When it was over, I walked out of the bank with a balance attached to my name so large it did not feel like money. It felt like a mistake, but the real shock wasn't the deposit. It was the certainty, settling cold and permanent in my bones, that my family had set fire to something real. And when they found out, they were not going to let me keep it quietly. I drove straight to my grandmother's house. She was in the kitchen, exactly where I should have known she'd be, pouring coffee into the chipped mug with the painted bluebird on the side. "You went to the bank," she said before I even closed the door. "Yes." "Was Simon dramatic?" "He locked me in his office." "That sounds like Simon." I stood there with my coat still on, snow melting off my boots onto her clean floor. It's real. Yes. All of it? The check? Yes. No, I said, my voice breaking. I mean all of it. Whatever this is. Whatever you've done. She looked at me for a long time, then set down her cup. Your grandfather left me $400,000 when he died, she said. A house, some land, and an insurance policy. Not enough to impress anyone, enough to be careful with. I sat. She sat across from me. I taught piano for 32 years, she went on. I knew scales, children, and how to stretch a pot of soup. I did not know markets. So I started reading. I asked questions. I wrote letters to a financial columnist in Boston whose advice I respected. He answered everyone. Years later, he asked me to invest in a private venture. I did. It grew. Then it grew again. She said it so simply, it took me a second to understand what she was telling me. How much? I whispered. Her mouth lifted at one corner. Enough that $5 million each was an experiment, not a sacrifice. I forgot to breathe. Nora, she said gently, I am worth a little over $40 million. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was too large to fit anywhere else. You're serious. Deadly. Why didn't anyone know? She shrugged. No one asked with love, only with appetite. Then she leaned forward. I did not hand out money on Christmas Eve, she said. I handed out mirrors. I felt cold all over. Your father didn't ask if it was real. No. Your mother didn't ask why. No. Chase and Sienna didn't either. No. She took a sip of coffee. And you thanked me. My phone started vibrating before she could say anything else. Once, twice, again. I looked at the screen. Sienna, Chase, Mom, Dad. Sienna again, Mom, unknown number, Chase. How do they know already? I asked. My grandmother smiled, almost sadly. Banks are discreet. Families are not. I didn't answer. By the end of that hour, I had 32 missed calls, 19 texts, and 4 voicemails. Sienna's messages shifted fastest. OMG, was it real? Nora, answer me. I didn't mean it like that. I was joking. You know I was joking. I need mine back. Call me now. Chase was less subtle. Don't get smug. That money belongs to the family. You better not think you're special. My mother cried in a voicemail. Real tears at first, then performance tears, then accusation. You know how hard things have been for us. You know your father is under pressure. You can't just keep something like that when this family is struggling. My father's message was only 7 seconds long. Bring it back. Bring it back, as if it were a casserole dish. 40 minutes later, his truck came up the drive. My grandmother saw it through the kitchen window. She put down her toast, stood carefully, and walked to the front hallway. He pounded once. Mom, open the door. She did not. He tried the handle. For the first time in nearly half a century, it did not turn. Mom! She stood behind the glass, straight-backed, despite the pain I knew she was in. Calvin, she said through the door, it is the day after Christmas. This is not a good day for foolishness. You gave her $5 million. I gave each of you $5 million. She tricked us. No, she said calmly. You revealed yourselves. He hit the doorframe with his palm so hard I flinched. Open this door. Go home, Calvin. It was not loud. It did not need to be. After a long second, he stepped back. His face had gone a color I'd only seen on him once before, years earlier, when the plant had passed him over for promotion, and he realized authority could be withheld. He left without another word. My grandmother locked the deadbolt again, walked back to the kitchen, and sat down. Well, she said, buttering another piece of toast, that has begun. The strange thing about grief is that sometimes it waits politely until conflict has made a little space for it. January came hard, the phone harassment slowed only because rage needs fresh oxygen, and my family had already burned through the first tank. My father stopped calling and switched to tight-lipped emails about fairness and legal expectations. My mother sent messages that tried on 3 costumes at once: sorrow, guilt, and practical need. Chase threatened to come, sort it out face-to-face, then didn't. Sienna posted vague little videos about betrayal and toxic relatives and the burden of being misunderstood by blood. And all the while my grandmother grew thinner. She moved more carefully from room to room. She sat down between tasks. She fell asleep mid-afternoon with a book open on her lap. Sometimes I'd arrive on Saturday and find her staring out at the feeder, where a single cardinal came every morning as if keeping appointment. Then one Tuesday in mid-January, she slipped on ice in the yard while scattering seed. Mabel found her. The front door was half open, the bowl of birdseed in the snow, my grandmother on the ground with one hand still curled like she had been trying to hold on to something invisible. The hospital wanted to admit her for surgery and evaluation. She refused. Not rudely. Absolutely. By then she had already signed hospice paperwork months earlier with Dr. Annika Shaw and Arthur Bell, the attorney Simon had mentioned. Everything was prepared. Everything was legal. Everything was exactly as she wanted. I took leave from school. Mrs. Benton, my principal, looked at me across her desk while I explained and simply said, "Family first. Don't count days. Just go." So I moved into my grandmother's spare room with the floral wallpaper and the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. My friend Eli helped carry my bags in, and then, because he was the sort of man who understood mercy as silence, did not ask me a single dramatic question. Hospice began. If you have never watched someone you love diminish slowly in the very house where you first learned safety, I hope you never do. It is a sacred kind of helplessness. You become aware of every small sound, the spoon against the mug, the radiator knocking, the effort it takes someone to turn over in bed. The tiny change in breath that makes you stand up before your mind has fully understood why. At night I read to her, Willa Cather, Eudora Welty, old letters, recipes. Sometimes the newspaper if she felt like criticizing politicians. Sometimes she slept before I finished a page. Sometimes she corrected my pronunciation while half asleep. My father came once, 22 minutes. He stood at the foot of her bed and said she should let Chase move in and manage things. My grandmother, barely able to lift her hand some days, still had enough strength to say, "Calvin, if I wanted to be managed, I'd have raised a better man." He left so fast the screen door slammed. He never came back. Near the end, she asked me to open the top drawer of her dresser. Inside was a brass key tied to a faded leather cord. "Arthur Bell will ask for this," she said. "What does it open?" "You'll see." "Grandma," she squeezed my fingers, astonishingly strong for a moment. "Not yet. Soon." That word soon became a room I could not stop standing in. She died on a Tuesday morning in early February just before dawn, while the house was still blue with pre-sunrise cold. I had fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed. I woke because the furnace clicked off. That was it. No dramatic gasp, no movie speech, no hand reaching toward heaven. Just the sudden, unbearable stillness of a room that had been occupied by a soul 1 second earlier and was now occupied only by memory. Her hand was still in mine. It was warm. The cardinal came to the feeder 20 minutes later. I noticed because I couldn't stop noticing everything. Mabel arrived within the hour and held the other side of the bed as if she had been holding my grandmother up in one way or another for half a lifetime. When I called my father, he went silent long enough that I thought grief had finally found him. Then my mother's voice came onto the line, and her first question was, "What day is the funeral? I need to move something on the 10th. That was when whatever tenderness I still had for them hardened into something cleaner. The funeral happened that Saturday. My grandmother had left written instructions for everything. Mustard cardigan. Small family plot beside my grandfather. No church sermon longer than 10 minutes. No eulogy from my father. A poem read by me. They all came. They all cried. And I promise you this. There is no sound more revolting than performative grief in a room that still smells faintly of the person you failed. My father's suit didn't fit. My mother leaned heavily on him for effect. Chase stared at his shoes as if boredom were an affliction. Sienna wore oversized sunglasses and posted a filtered photograph of the procession before the burial was over. Caption: Grief changes you. I read the poem because she asked me to. I did not break until that night when I came back to her empty house, saw the mug still in the dish rack, and understood that from now on every Saturday would have a missing center. If you've ever lost someone who loved you without bargaining, you know what I mean. Leave their name in the comments if you want. I always read those carefully. Because what happened after my grandmother died would have been unbearable if I hadn't known, beyond doubt, that at least one person in this world had seen me clearly. Arthur Bell called the following Monday. His voice was deep, slow, and steady, as though it had been trained specifically to move through family disaster without slipping. "There will be a formal reading of Vivian Mercer's will on the 20th, he said. "All immediate family are named parties. I advise you to attend." "I'll be there." He paused. "Do you have a brass key?" My heart kicked. "Yes." "Bring it." The will reading took place in a paneled conference room above Bell and Mercer Legal, an old office downtown that smelled like dust, leather, and coffee brewed too early. A clock on the wall ticked loudly enough to feel accusatory. My father sat at one side of the table, jaw already tight. My mother sat beside him, one hand on his sleeve like a woman auditioning for widowhood. Chase sprawled back in his chair, overconfident in the way stupid men often are right before humiliation. Sienna had to be asked twice to put her phone away. Mabel sat beside me at my grandmother's request, her spine arrow straight, her gloves folded in her lap. Arthur Bell entered with a dark green file. He didn't clear his throat theatrically, didn't drag out the tension. He simply opened the file, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. The bequests came first. Specific items. Mabel received the bridge set. The Church Historical Archive received my grandfather's soldered silver star. The elementary school received her upright piano. I received the Bluebird mug. My father looked annoyed already, as if sentiment were taking too long to turn into money. Then Arthur Bell turned a page. "The remainder of the estate," he said, "including the residence at 114 Linden Hill Road, the surrounding 23 acres, all investment accounts, remaining liquid assets, and all associated personal effects. Estimated net value $40,200,000 after prior distributions, is left in full to Nora Elise Mercer." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The clock kept ticking. My father was the first to recover. He stood so abruptly, his chair scraped the floor. "Is this a joke?" Arthur Bell did not look up. "No." My mother made a small broken sound. Chase's eyes snapped to me with naked hatred. Sienna had already reached for her purse where her phone was hidden. Arthur Bell continued in the same calm voice. "Attached to this bequest is a personal statement from the testator to be entered into the record." He unfolded a second page and read, "I leave my estate to my granddaughter Nora because she came when there was nothing to gain. She visited without agenda, listened without impatience, and cared for me without calculation. She was present in my life not for inheritance, but for love. The others were given opportunity enough to reveal their hearts." When he finished, the room stayed silent for one long, perfect second. Then it exploded. My father called it manipulation. My mother cried that I had turned Vivian against them. Chase accused me of poisoning an old woman's mind. Sienna said none of this was normal, and started talking about contesting everything before Arthur Bell had even gathered the pages. I said nothing, because underneath the shock, underneath the grief, underneath the awful trembling relief that she had chosen me so clearly, another realization had already started to form. This will was not the end of the fight. It was the opening shot. The lawsuit arrived 4 days later in a thick manila envelope that seemed too heavy to contain only paper. Undue influence. That was their claim. They alleged I had manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman into altering her estate in my favor while isolating her from the family. When I read it, I laughed. Not because it was funny, because some wounds are so shameless they almost become absurd. Arthur Bell agreed to represent me without fee. "I was her attorney for 30 years, he said. "Let me finish one final job for her." My father attempted to arrange a private family conversation. Arthur responded on my behalf and made it clear all communication must go through counsel. My mother sent tearful messages about how court would destroy the family's name. Chase left one voicemail so threatening Arthur forwarded it to the clerk preemptively. Sienna posted vague videos about elder abuse without naming names, which somehow made them even more obvious. And so probate war began. For 8 months, my name sat opposite theirs in official filings. For 8 months, I taught fractions and reading comprehension by day and reviewed affidavits by night. For 8 months, people in town nodded at me a little too gently in the grocery store. And then in May, Arthur came with me to open the safe the brass key belonged to. It was hidden in the back of my grandmother's bedroom closet, behind a row of winter cardigans and a stack of old sheet music. You'd miss it completely unless you knew exactly where to look. The key turned on the first try. Inside were 3 things. The first was a legal folder so thick it looked almost excessive. Capacity evaluations, witness statements, date-stamped copies of prior wills, letters from Dr. Annika Shaw documenting sound mind, clear intent, repeated confirmation, not one evaluation. 3. Arthur Bell let out the smallest breath of admiration. She anticipated every move they would make, he said. Of course she had. The second item was a bundle of cards tied with blue ribbon. At first I didn't understand what they were. Then I read the top one and nearly stopped breathing. It was a birthday card I had made her when I was 4, a crooked sun in orange crayon, 3 backward letters in my name, glitter that still clung stubbornly to the paper. Underneath it were more. Every birthday card, every Mother's Day note from school projects I'd given her, because you're more fun than Mom. Every Christmas card, every thank you card, every little scrap I'd ever written to her, all kept, all dated, all preserved. And beneath that lay the third item, a green leather notebook tied shut with what looked like an old shoelace. I opened it sitting right there on her bedroom floor. Each page held a date and a line or two in her slanted blue handwriting. March 12, 2014. Nora came with tulips. We discussed whether courage is teachable. August 9, 2015. Nora came tired from summer school prep, fell asleep in the chair after pie. December 3, 2016. Nora brought oranges and fixed the porch light. Snow expected tonight. Page after page, week after week, Saturday after Saturday. Not all sentimental, not all profound, just true. A record, proof of presence, proof that love, when it is real, leaves traces. By the time I reached the later pages, I was crying too hard to read cleanly. Arthur had stepped politely into the hallway to give me privacy, but I could see his shoulders had gone rigid too. There were 483 entries. She had counted me all those years, and suddenly I understood the most devastating part of all of this. My grandmother had not chosen me in a sudden burst of end-of-life emotion. She had chosen me with evidence. The hearing was set for October. By then, leaves had started turning copper at the edges, and the town had followed the case the way small towns follow weather, scandal, and funerals. Not loudly, but thoroughly. Judge Eleanor Pierce presided, sharp-eyed. 70, if she was a day. A woman who had known my grandmother distantly in school decades earlier, but stated on record that their relationship had never exceeded acquaintance. No objection from the plaintiffs. Arthur Bell laid out our case with almost insulting simplicity. Valid will. Multiple medical competency evaluations. Independent witnesses. No evidence of coercion. Then Dr. Annika Shaw took the stand. If you ever want to watch a bad legal claim die in real time, put a calm, precise physician in front of a judge and let her answer questions truthfully. She testified that my grandmother had been fully competent at each evaluation. Oriented, informed, decisive. More mentally precise, in Dr. Shaw's words, than many people 30 years younger. She had independently explained her reasoning for favoring me, repeatedly, without prompting, over time. Then Mabel testified. She wore a navy coat dress and the silver brooch my grandmother had once given her for winning a bridge tournament in 1989. Vivian Mercer, she said, could no more be manipulated than the moon could be bribed. Even the